Moral philosophers, when they talk about moral philosophy, usually are dividing the whole topic up into two basic approaches. Do we focus on rules or do we focus on results? The rules-oriented approach to moral philosophy is the idea that, well, there are rational moral laws that we should follow. One very classic example of this idea is known as divine command ethics. God has decreed, or the universe in its divine wisdom has decreed, that this is how we should act, this is how we should behave, this is how we should treat other people, and that's it. We have had that decree, that's the law, we follow the law, we obey the law. Immanuel Kant put this into a more philosophical, rationalist point of view, in which he simply said that because the world is rational, there are rational moral laws, and our one and only duty morally is to believing and following the moral laws. Simple, right? Just do what you're told. Well, one person that disagreed with that was Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher in the 1700s, who, in a weird quirk of philosophy, in the 1780s, and Kant was writing his book about our duty to the moral law, Bentham was writing his book about how this is full of nonsense, and this is what we should focus on, the results of actions. Morality, Bentham says, is a question of what brings about the best result. So he wants to eliminate all rules and concentrate only on what are the consequences of actions, which is why his philosophy and all the various philosophies that side with this end of the spectrum in moral philosophy is known as consequentialism. We focus on the consequences of actions. Well, that's all fine and good, but there's some problems with it. The biggest problem, of course, is, well, how do you measure the results? We are not psychic. We do not know what the future has to hold. Life, of course, is ridiculously complex. People are ridiculously different and incredibly varied in their life experiences and what they want and what they need. And so when Bentham talks about happiness as the guide, yes, it's all about happiness, he says. What brings about the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest number of people? He says that, well, we've got pain, and pleasure. Pleasure are the two great masters, pain and pleasure. I can't write. Pain and pleasure, those are the two great masters of what humans do. And yes, Bentham is getting this from Hobbes. Hobbes, the great materialist, determinist, who said that pain and pleasure, that's it. Everything that human beings do is just avoiding pain and trying to maximize pleasure. That's it. We are buffeted like corks on the surface of an ocean by these two sovereign masters of our fates and our actions. Bentham is taking a very similar tack and saying, look, if happiness is what we want pleasure, we don't want pain, so morality is very simply an issue of how do we move from here to there. Simple, right? It's almost as simple sounding at first as, oh, there's a moral law, you obey the moral law. And Bentham is really serious about this. He says, okay, look, we can say this is minus 10, this is 0, this is plus 10 in terms of this pain-pleasure spectrum. And this pain-pleasure spectrum is something where if we have an action that we could take that would eliminate pain, let's say we go from minus 4, because we're in a lot of pain, to minus 2, well, then that's a good action. If we go from minus 4 to minus 5, that's a bad action. So if you have two choices, take the one that moves us in that direction on the spectrum. Similarly, if an action that we could take goes from plus 4 to plus 5, well, that's better than an action that takes us from plus 4 to plus 3. And if that sounds almost silly in saying, oh, we can assess a number to this, Bentham is serious about that. He thinks that because everything is determined and everything is rational and all this sort of thing, we could just measure it all out. The hedonistic calculus, he said, we can eventually figure out as scientists how to measure pain and pleasure, how to measure happiness, and say, okay, well, here we have a situation where the happiness of this person is a 3, and we can figure out how to maximize that happiness within a given situation. And he extends this to all of society. He says, hey, if our society right now is a -6 because things are really bad right now, what would move that on the chart? Now, it's not as simple as just one dimension. I mean, the pain and pleasure thing is one dimension, but he says that there are many subdimensions that go into this in terms of what happiness is, because happiness can be measured in multiple ways. I won't go into all of them right now, but most important to realize in what he's talking about is the idea that happiness, is it lasting? Does it endure over time because a temporary pleasure is less valuable than a long-term pleasure? Is it immediate, or do we have to wait for it? I don't want to have to wait 5 years for an action to be pleasurable. I want it now. Very human emotion there. And how widespread will it? Is it just my happiness, or is it happiness for a greater number of people? And so on. It's like we break it down, and again, it all sounds very rational. It all sounds very reasonable, and Bentham was totally sold on this idea. What are the consequences of an action? Does it bring about the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people? Then that's what governmental policy should be. And Bentham was very involved in the idea of how to make government better, how to make society better. He wanted to say, let's get rid of these ridiculous concepts of moral laws and a really ridiculous concept of human rights, which was John Locke's idea. Bentham said that that was silly. Nonsense on stilts, he said, about the idea of human rights, because Bentham hated everybody. Locke was stupid. Good thing he never read Kant. He would have thought Kant was a complete, catastrophic idiot. In any event, Bentham wanted all of society to be run along this very simple hedonistic calculus of how do we maximize happiness. Now, this utilitarianism, as Bentham wanted to call it, because he said that however we can utilize the things in our world to make more happiness, that's what utility is, so he calls it utilitarianism. Most people like to call it consequentialism because it does focus on consequences. And even people who like consequentialism or utilitarianism are aware that there are some very real problems with it. Because if the only thing that matters morally, as Bentham says, is that we are maximizing happiness, we're trying to say that we want longer pleasure, greater pleasure, more widespread pleasure, more immediate pleasure, then we get into situations that like this. One of the best examples that's been ever given about the problem of consequentialism is you're at a hospital. You're running a hospital, and you have 4 patients. Of these 4 patients, one requires a heart transplant, one requires a lung transplant, one requires a kidney transplant, and one requires, I forget what the other 4th one is. It's not a brain transplant or something, but a liver, that's it. Heart, lungs, kidneys, liver. Okay, so those are the 4. 4 patients, they will be dead within days if they do not get organ donor. So, as you are standing there in the hospital that you run, in walks an otherwise perfectly healthy, homeless person. Well, if the only thing that matters is maximizing happiness, hello, homeless person, sit down, have a little anesthesia, harvest those organs, healthy lungs, healthy heart, healthy liver, healthy kidneys, transplant into the 4 patients, and you have sadly eliminated the life of 1 person, but you've saved the life of 4 people. 4 is higher than 1, isn't it? And if 4 is greater than 1, then you have gone from 1 to 4 on the scale, and this is a morally defensible action. It was a homeless person. No one will miss this person. No one will care about this person. But the families of these 4 people that we have saved by harvesting the organs from this homeless person, they will be very happy. So we're even above 4 here. We're talking like 8, 9, like lots of happiness. So yes, we should kill people if it makes other people happy. There's like the Roman Forum, the gladiatorial combat. It's like, hey, feed those Christians to the lions because it makes the hoi polloi happy. Now, if you don't have a problem with this, you probably have something wrong with you, because there's something within us, and here's where Hume's moral theory actually bears a lot of weight, and it's a shame that so few people really think about what Hume said. Hume said that there are just certain actions where we just feel inside as human beings. That's wrong. We are repelled by that idea, and most people are repelled at the suggestion of this thought experiment of, well, we just kill this person to save these others. We want to save the others. We want to maximize happiness. We want to be moral. But there's something about, okay, well, we kill to do that. We violate someone's freedom and their sense of free will to do something for somebody else that just feels wrong to us. Now, Kant, of course, would say that it's morally wrong to kill for no good reason. Murder is wrong because it's wrong, it's irrational, the universe has decreed this is not how it works. Bentham would say, well, hey, go for it. Whether he actually would go with that example, we don't know because it was developed years later. But Bentham seems to really be committed to this idea of we can sacrifice in one area if it benefits a greater area. And that gets into our treatment of minority populations. Well, if it makes the majority of people happy to just slaughter these minority people, well, go for it. And of course, then we don't have to bitch, whine, and moan about these minorities anymore because we killed them all, so hey, net happiness. Now, some utilitarians would say with some justification that I'm oversimplifying this, but of course it's not just me that's oversimplifying this. This is something that's been debated and argued about for many, many decades now. Again, Bentham wrote this in the 1780s, so it's been a long time that we've had to discuss this. And Bentham's ideas were immediately popular in terms of discussing them. Yes, let's discuss them. Let's not necessarily employ them in our daily lives. And yet, despite the fact that there are some very real problems with this utilitarian idea, this consequentialist idea, we do this. Bentham is correct in that we do think this way in a lot of situations. Most of this is in terms of personal choices. Do I wish to do action A or action B? Well, action A gives me somewhere on this line, but action B gives me further along there. My favorite example of that is I have a toothache, so I'm like somewhere on the pain side of things. And so I should have the tooth fixed. Well, that's going to cause me more pain in the short term. But in the long term, once the tooth is fixed, I will have less pain. And so we do this hedonistic calculus of, I will put up with some short-term pain to have long-term pleasure. Well, that's utilitarian thinking. It is a better utility to me to take the action of going to the dentist than to not go to the dentist. But of course, we're afraid of going to the dentist, and the dentist is unpleasant, and so we kind of sit there and work with the pain until the pain becomes too unbearable for us to continue any longer, and then we suck it up and go to the dentist. And that whole scenario is very true to what Bentham is trying to say. So he does have a point. And that's where John Stuart Mill comes in. John Stuart Mill said, and I won't belabor this point, but he basically simply said, look, the basic idea of utility, maximizing happiness, and utilizing choices to maximize happiness. That's a good idea. But we need to also take into account that there really are certain actions that are just morally repugnant, reprehensible, and we just cannot abide by them. So we won't. He also said that the simple idea of just thinking in terms of the line here, this two-dimensional line of pain and pleasure, that's too simplistic. Because there are some pleasures that are better than others, some pains that are worse than others. And so we have to really assess this in much more fine detail. Mill famously said that it is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. As in, it is better to be someone that has questions and doubts and human problems than to just be a stupid animal wallowing in the mud and, hey, I'm happy because I'm wallowing in mud. I've got food, I've got mud. What else do I need? And Mill says, no, there's something unsettling about that. And that goes back kind of to Aristotle's idea of, well, we're not just looking for pleasure, we're looking for this eudaimonia, this long-term satisfaction with life. So Mill is going with that idea. And that has helped utilitarianism move along in terms of it being not just a simplistic thing, no matter how many dimensions of the hedonistic calculus Bentham wants to add to all of this. It's still a situation where we're just talking about a net sum game here, and that's not going to work. Mill is correct. We do have to take into consideration the human element, and we have to take into consideration free will, which Bentham denies, but Mill, of course, very, very famously likes. So, yes, utilitarianism, interesting idea, complicated idea, highly problematic idea, but one that we do have to take into account. We have to throw it into the mix of, when we talk about moral philosophy, we need to talk about, remember my first thing up here, results versus rules. How do we make those things, rules and results, work together for a better, more fulfilling moral philosophy?